Okay, I will say a few words in Slovenian language, then we will continue in English language. Predstavljam profesorja Daniela Millerja z University College v Londonu kot našega glavnega gosta na tej konferenci in ob tej priložnosti predstavljamo tudi pravkar izšlo drugo knjigo iz založbe Studia humanitatis Daniela Millerja, prva njegova knjiga, Materialna kultura v izvirniku Stav je išla na začetku letošnjega leta, druga knjiga, Potrošnja, njene posledice, je išla pravkar. Obe knjigi sta med sabo povezani, sta premislek in refleksija Millerjevega dela v prejšnjih desetletjih, posvečenega materialni kulturi, njeni etnologiji, njeni antropologiji in zakaj sta razdeljeni deli tako, kot je povedal Daniel Miller sam. Se pravi, predvsem bomo tukaj specialno poskušali predstaviti skozi pogovor drugo knjigo, Potrošnja, njene posledice, in seveda potem je priložnost, da Daniela Millerja vprašate še tudi o drugih rečeh. Well, as I have already told in Slovenian language, stuff and consumption and its consequences are the first two of your books in Slovenian language. I am quite sure that they are not the last. Both books are in some sense a reconsideration of your previous work. How do you see them now? I think about 5 years since these two books were first published. How do you see them in relation to your present work? Let's begin with this question.
Thank you very much. And actually, even before I answer the question, I think I just have to express my gratitude to all the people that were involved. I mean, the people who first conceived of the idea of doing the publication. I'm told the translation is excellent, although I cannot, of course, myself read it. And so I really am very grateful to all those involved. But one of the points I would say is I would hope that my work always is dynamic. That basically that I never wanted to say that writing two books that were, exactly as you say, a consolidation and a summary of things that I had done before represent, in a sense, not the end of something, but a stage in something. What it means is that in some ways you can transform what you've done before. So, for example, when I first wrote about the Hegelian foundations of a lot of the ideas that came subsequently, I was coming out of Cambridge and writing in a very difficult way, very hard to read. So by taking some of the philosophical work and making it lighter, it enabled me to reach, I think, much wider audiences. So it doesn't just consolidate, it also changes. Then, having done that, you also feel, okay, you have demonstrated the capacity of these approaches. Where can we now take this? And as I had been discussing earlier today, one of the points is to take it to unexpected places, because it would be quite conservative to say, oh, because it's stuff, you are only constrained by the things that people regard as evidently material. So for me, it was quite exciting to say, hold on, actually the interesting thing is let's take it to a digital world, a world in which people actually often don't think of as particularly material. And what I was trying to do this morning is argue that the same kind of approaches actually reveal a great deal about those digital worlds that a non-material culture approach would not do. So for me, it's a step, it's a stage, but definitely not the end of something. It's simply, like any step, a step is something that allows you to go higher. And that is what I would hope the step would be.
Of course, in Slovenia, I think with Slava Žižek, Mladen Dolar and others, nobody should really be afraid of the abstractness of your first books. So, I would just like to add before we continue that both books were translated by Polona Petek. Thanks to Polona for her translation. And both books, of course, are available in the bookshop today with 20% of discount. There are a few things that the reader of consumption and its consequences can see at the first sight. This is the organization of the book, which is relatively, let's say, uncommon in humanities, but in my opinion is very kind to the reader in a sense that those parts which are the core of the book and which are solid and very original ethnography are surrounded in the beginning and in the end in something which a little bit resembles ancient dialogues. Also, it is, although it is not a dialogue, it is in effect polylogue, trialogue between, as you describe it, two, let's say, versions of your, or two elements of your personality. Why did you decide for such a structure, and what does it convey, in your opinion, which could not be or would not be as adequately presented in another way?
I think there's really two points to make there. One is, as time goes on, I've come to realize that actually writing is just as important as researching. One without the other just doesn't work. There's no point doing this work unless people are able to see it, that it's clear, it's accessible, and people learn from it. Otherwise, kind of, why do we do it? And I, generally speaking, always kind of resist a certain kind of conservatism. Just because we always wrote like that doesn't mean that is the way we should always write. So I am constantly experimenting with different forms. I mean, the book I have coming out in a couple of days, a lot of it is actually direct interview transcript to try and give voice to people in a different way. So I believe that one should be adventurous in trying out the different forms. But the second part of your question is, why in that particular instance did we use this form? And the reason was because it was, the subject in this case was about climate change and sustainability and issues which I think almost any middle-class dinner party will probably raise if, in the way they might talk about the weather or something else. And in some ways I wanted to both reflect that this is something of common debate, but also show that actually this is actually really important. I mean, putting it like that makes it sound very superficial. But actually, we really are talking about the single most important problem facing the planet. The most important. That which could actually destroy the planet. So there has to be a way of taking the genre that is there and actually using that to try and say, but this frames something that we all have a responsibility to face, and we have to work out not just opinions traded together in this banter, but conclusions. What at the end of all that are we actually going to support and do? And one of the points of the book is I take if you read the middle sections, as it were, where I make suggestions, or at least in the end section, I come up with things that probably people would never expect me to say, because I put the emphasis much more on things like production, etc. So I think that you experiment with writing, but not just as a gimmick, not just as a play. You try and make your experiments with writing fit the particular content and purpose of that writing. And for me, in that instance, it seemed to have an affinity with the way in which people converse about what is actually such a central problem to our times?
The, let's say, tree person that is presented in your book is interesting because it is, consists of a green person, let's say, a red person in their worldview regarding, let's say, saving the planet and global warming and so on. And the third one, which is feminine and from the third world, from Philippines, presents the third possible perspective. What I found interesting is that you are quite clear in this part of the book that it is not enough to expect that the changes in individual consumption would somehow be able to save the planet. But on the other side, the structure of the book itself says is a kind of is addressed precisely to the individual consumer. Some people would also say not only individual consumer, but individual consumer of a certain social class, or maybe even a Westerner.
I have always opposed the idea that consumption is essentially about individuals. To me, this is the economist's kind of abstract modelling, whereas for me, as an anthropologist, consumption is always a social practice, and a practice that varies from site to site. And a Filipino has as much right to be involved in these global discourses as somebody from anywhere else, which is one of the points that is being made there. But I suppose that this is the surprising thing in a way, and it surprised even me. I'm writing about consumption, so I think my expertise is from the study of consumption. So you would expect that when I come to the climax of the book, the conclusion, I would be saying, okay, what do we in the body of consumers do about this problem? But I have to follow what I see as evidence. And in the end, I realize this is the wrong way to save a planet, because it reduces it not necessarily to individual choice, because I think it's a social phenomena, but consumption is about choosing. It is about, do we do this way or do we do that way? And I realize saving the planet cannot be a question of consumer choice. You cannot have people saying, well, today I feel like it will be a good thing to save the planet. Next day, I'm kind of not so sure, maybe it's more interesting to do something else. It's too important to leave to these issues. And the argument that I make, therefore, is that actually we have to go beneath that, to issues of regulation, to issues of production. There are chemicals that simply should not be used. There are things that should not be made. And also because I'm realizing from the literature that it has to be an egalitarian issue. Saving the planet has to be the same for everybody. If you make it around consumption, then, and you say, you ban cars on alternate days, then rich people can buy 2 cars. And it actually becomes a whole question of inequality and differentiation. So essentially, one thing I always try to do is to work against myself. If it's in my interest to make it about consumption, then I will fight that and say, no, is the argument that I'm making the right argument? Just because it suits me. And that's partly also because I think a lot of academia now has become politicized in the wrong way. Mm-hmm. People want to be able to kind of make a stance, and they make everything fit. And I always try and say, wait, actually this doesn't fit. It doesn't work. It's not saying what I want it to say, but let's have the integrity to say what I think it actually does say. And that's, in a sense, one of the things that I'm trying to do here.
Yes, it goes well with the title of your book, which I would like to emphasize is Consumption and its Consequences. Mm. Because usually consumption in social sciences is seen as a consequence itself, and a consequence in a kind of flat way, very like in vulgar Marxism, you have production and and the consumption is its simple consequence. This is one version. There are other versions which are just as much simplified. One you mentioned, this is the simple idea of choice, which is we always have a choice, and the conditions of this choice are usually not well thought. But what this book does, and this is here is its originality, is that you research consequences of consumption, and to be able to do that, your concept of consumption is quite different from the one which has been maybe most popular in humanities. It is the one which is used in cultural studies and is semiologically, basically, in its approach. And if I have to say it in a few words, I would say that the semiological approach implies that the people or small communities more or less freely express themselves through consumption and through use of these objects which you see as a part of the social process of consumption. How would you describe something which is in fact not described but demonstrated through your description of, let's say, what wearing jeans means, or how do we shop? So maybe we should just compare what, in which sense, for instance, your view about what shopping is differs from the semiological one, for which tries, let's say, to make an analogy between shopping and reading.
I mean, I think one of the points that the point where there's the most explicit repudiation of this kind of semiotics is actually probably when we're talking about the genes, because 2 or 3 things come out of that. One is that the argument that the actual reason that we wear jeans is precisely because they are not semiotic in the conventional sense. We wear them because they don't express anything except that kind of nothingness. That's why they can go with anything, because we are worried about what our other possible clothings might say about us, so we find something that says nothing at all, and that has led jeans to becoming the dominant form of clothing we have. But it's not just, in a sense, repudiating a simple notion of self-expression. It also, in a sense, repudiates a lot of things like, in a sense, that concept of choice. Because, when economists think, oh, we decide what we want, we make a rational choice, etc., what is clear is that people have actually, in some ways, no idea what blue jeans are, why they buy them, and what this whole configuration is about. And so much is going on that is sort of underneath all that. So at a conference where we have the title, Things Make People, a lot of the time I'm trying to understand why assemblages around all the different objects and the way they relate together configure a situation in which then people act to consume. And it's not like they're coming at either as individuals. I mean, to have the idea of an individual relationship to blue jeans is crazy. It's so much now a global manifestation of something that is so much bigger than any person's perception, and the evidence that they don't themselves understand their own practices. So there is far more social analysis that has to be going on than can be just garnered from an attempt to see things as a representation, a self-expression, and that sort of semiological tradition, which is probably what I started with when I first started working on consumer goods, because it was the time of semiotics. It was kind of supreme in social sciences.
Daniel's book is also, I should say, a demonstration to sociologists, I'm a sociologist, about epistemology. You have a very clear, somewhere in your book, you say very clearly something I like very much. I just I never had the courage to say it as loudly, and this is, when I begin ethnography, it is without hypothesis.
Yeah, for me, it is really important to get away from that kind of epistemological tradition. The idea that still today, people will take their students and say, you cannot go into the field until I hear what is your hypothesis. And I think this is a real weakening of the possibilities of research, particularly in something like anthropology. I suggest that people go into the field to encounter things they didn't know were there. That's why you go there, to see things. And if you didn't know it was there, how can you have a hypothesis about it? You can't. To me, research is iterative, it's opportunistic. If I would always tell a student that consistency is your enemy. Actually, you should be changing your mind, you should be changing your goal, you should be changing your understanding of what you're doing all the time. So that, to me, this very, very standard tradition of hypothesis testing, I understood it in the natural sciences. I can understand where it comes from, but I see it as completely inappropriate for the work that we do, because you can't hypothesize about something you don't know exists. And that's why we do our research, is to find out what is actually going on.
Yes, but if we read carefully, your ethnography also has, let's say, a protocol, how I should call it, which is quite strict in a sense. If you want to study shopping, you must begin in the social context of real people shopping. From the beginning, from the idea of going shopping, to the conclusion of what is done with the things that are bought.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in a way the two things go together. So when I started working on shopping, I mean, I didn't have a hypothesis, but out there were loads of suggestions that what shopping is about. And one of the common things that were being said, shopping, we have a problem because it's leading to this individualism and this hedonism and this materialism, etc., etc. And you're right. What I do is say, I don't know, I'm just going to go shopping with people every day for a year. And what do I find? Well, the first thing I find is that the people who are doing most of the shopping that I'm with are housewives. And actually, when I work with these housewives, they don't strike me as the most materialistic, the most hedonistic, the most individualistic people in our society. Actually, quite the opposite. And then I start looking and saying, well, what actually is going on? Now, I did not set out to write a book about love. If you had asked me a hypothesis, what is shopping about, it would not have been in my brain to say, actually, this is really the best way to understand the nature of love. But the book I wrote was a book about love, because every day what I'm actually dealing with is a mother thinking about her children. And how actually she can do the things that she's passionate about, because this is an expression of love. And so then I have to re-understand shopping as a technology of love, which puts me in a completely different realm. But the point is, I follow what I found. You're every day with these people, and if you're open to it, I think you see love. It's in front of you every day. And therefore you have to confront it, and that's what you write about. So
I would say that also your epistemology is in a sense optimistic, in a sense that if you, for instance, take 50 people in a pattern, in a similar circumstances, you expect that there will be some pattern, which will make you think.
Yeah, I mean, one of the key influences on my work was surely Bourdieu and the notions of habitus, etc. And anthropology its foundation is normativity. Normativity means that people in a given context start to engage with the world and understand what is appropriate and what is not appropriate. And that starts to create constraints and expectations and pattern. What you might call typicality. One doesn't want to exaggerate that. One's always open to the eccentric and the creative and the whole diversity of what you find. But perhaps fortunately for social science, we do find typicality and generality and normativity. And this allows us routes into understanding and explanation that mere, as it were, eccentric diversity would probably not give us.
Well, before we give a word to you, I would just like to stress one last characteristic of all the work of Daniel Miller, and it is that almost all of it was done in collaboration with others, from different cultures, with different experiences and, let's say, perspectives, maybe also different perspectives from yours. I don't think that it is necessary to explain why you do that, but I would rather ask you, what do you feel that is the consequence of doing things this way?
I mean, to me, I could never understand why a discipline called social anthropology wasn't social. Why actually it developed as almost a kind of individualistic, heroic act. You throw a person into the field and hopefully they kind of come back and then they're transformed and have become an anthropologist as an individual. That is not a social activity. The point of anthropology is to learn about people, not to create. And I mean, it's even worse. I mean, I think we live in an academic world where effectively to do books and things, you almost have to be self-branded as an individual. And I think we need to critique and transform what we do. Because then I think the promise of social science, social anthropology, will be much more fully realized. And we need to find new techniques. I mean, at the moment I'm doing a lot more writing which is team-based. I actually am quite interested in the possibilities of writing which is anonymous. I think we need to attack the individualism of social science, where what was the purpose of it? Is it to follow somebody who is becoming famous as an academic, or is it to learn about the world? And one is starting to actually deflect from the other. So the consequences of actually trying quite systematically to oppose our own culture and create something that is much more socially embedded and collective and collaborative is, I hope, that we will start going back to the point of all this, which is actually understanding other people, not promoting selves.
Thank you. I think we have now enough stuff to continue and to go from our words to consequences to your questions.
I totally agree and applaud to the idea of collective endeavors in science, but how can we change this culture and the system in the way we are constantly forced in that fetishizes individualism?
There are limits, but I think there are definitely possibilities. I mean, one of the things when I assembled the last team of 9 people, and I will say to the new team, there is a risk here, because you all need to get jobs. You all need to get a reputation that will enable you to succeed as an academic. And yet you're doing something in a collective vein. Is that going to constrain? Or, by working together, can we do something that is so, in a sense, not so successful, but achieves so much that everybody here will get respect for the mere fact that they were part of a collective effort, and the good news is they all are getting there. In other words, they were prepared to collaborate, etc. But you strike a balance between what is done collectively and what provides the autonomous evidence for an individual's contribution. Because the constraint is the world of reputation and job getting, etc. If it wasn't for that, I think actually we could collaborate. But the other point, which is strange, is of course in the natural sciences, this is accepted. Papers have many, many authors, most work is done by teams, and they still get academic jobs quite successfully. So it seems to me very strange that something called the social sciences is actually so much less collective in its endeavors than things that are just across the corridor and are also fully academic. So at least we could be as social as the natural sciences. That would be like a first ambition, and I think that's certainly achievable, and it would not be to the detriment of the individuals. But also, I think that, just to give an example, when we went to the AAA last time, we tried to present as a collective, and the structure wouldn't allow us. You have to fill it in as names. They won't allow you to have a collective identity. And I think these are kind of structures that we can start to challenge. We can challenge them certainly in the forms that we publish. A lot of the publication from our last project is anonymous. I mean, nobody can go on our website and say, who wrote this? It doesn't say. So in as much as you can do anonymous forms, and the same with our teaching, etc., I think increasingly we should be cultivating anonymity or the collective identity. And also I think there's a real problem in the whole area of things like citation, where it seems like we've lost the idea that where citation work, and we've now seemed to be citing people. It's like, is it sufficiently Foucauldian or Shepherd Hughes or Padua? I mean, it's like we consist only of a series of names and their reputations, and I think there is a great deal we can do to repudiate this, because it is a fetishism. It is, funnily enough, not a fetishism of things, but a fetishism of a person. And the Hegelian philosophy that I start from always says this. It says, whatever institution you're in, beware, because the internal structures will start to create things that actually turn you against the original purpose. The purpose was research and education, and we need to get back to that. And I really do believe one of the key ways of doing that is repudiating this individualism.
In my presentation of the book, I avoided one, let's say, part of it, but there was no real reason for this. This is about the stupid economy. The part that you wrote about audits, that is something which, of course, everybody who works in education, for instance, in Slovenia, or in any kind of, in fact, in any kind of administration, is subject to audits which are just as stupid as the ones that you described.
I think it goes with the last point. I mean, in a sense, what I was saying in response to you is that academia has become stupid, in as much as it's no longer an effective way of doing the thing that it purports to be in terms of research and education. One of the things I think that people really don't realise is how common this is to all institutional, and the biggest example is political economy. Because what I am very frustrated by is being taught by people who says there is this thing, capitalism, there is this thing, the neoliberal economy, it's incredibly effective, it works seamlessly, it does this to you and it does that to you. And I'm sitting there and thinking, have these people ever been inside a business? Have they ever seen the contradictions that take place between the various elements? And that's why in the book I give these examples of things like, how did capitalism in the UK get taken over by pension funds, where the representative is usually the most dispensable person. In other words, the person who wasn't actually being very effective ends up in the most powerful position. There are extraordinary contradictions because institutions, I think this is my sense, it's a very vulgar Hegelianism, but it's a kind of Hegelianism. Institutions have an intrinsic tendency to become stupid in that sense, in the sense that they subvert the actual original intentionality, the philosophy of right, of that institution, and end up in these very convoluted contradictory worlds than actually against each other. And one of my real problems is the representation of what's called neoliberal political economy, because I just don't think that is an accurate representation of how political economy works. And I think, again, you just have to you have to actually study the internal forms of this organization, and then you see things like these audits, which are supposed to do one thing and almost inevitably do the exact opposite. Any of us who've been through an ethics committee recently will know that it is the subversion of everything we ever called ethics. And this happens all the time.
I'm Tanya Achlin. Thank you for this earlier presentation and for the discussion today. I really liked your description of shopping as an expression of love. So that's quite a different approach to shopping. But you actually said that shopping is a technology of love. And I was wondering, why would you describe it as a technology in particular and not, for example, as a practice?
I actually really wouldn't mind at all if somebody wants to describe it as a technological practice, but there is a reason. I mean, you choose your semantics with intent. And to be honest, it's because I deal in a world where there is just not much respect for shoppers. These housewives are generally either ignored or unvalorized. I mean, they do all this work, and at the end of the day, they produce a meal, and people eat it in front of television and don't even notice what they've eaten. And if you're a housewife, this matters. And the way you combat this in part is by recognizing that this is an activity of skill. This is something that can be learned. This is something which builds. This is something which has techniques. And if you, as you are a shopper, if you do it day by day, if you understand the relationship between thrift and sales and what's attractive and what isn't, and actually which place, and actually just knowing about which shops to go to, how to get things, etc., I think that the reason for using the word technology was because suddenly think, wait a minute, if it's technology, it must be something you have to learn to do. It must be something that has skills. It must be something that has that has all that behind it. So, although I don't really, there's a semantic issue here for me, it's much more, in a sense, a pedagogical reason for using the word. I'm trying to get people to actually take a different perspective on what it is like to be somebody where one of your most important activities every day is actually shopping.
I guess we are a little bit tired, including you. So let's have a little bit of rest and take some energy in. Thank you.